Imagine holding a jar of honey that's thousands of years old, found sealed inside an ancient Egyptian tomb. And when it was finally discovered, it was still remarkably well preserved. No mold, no obvious spoilage, just honey, after thousands of years. But here's the real question. How did humans discover honey in the first place? Someone, somewhere, thousands of years ago, had to approach a wild beehive, surrounded by thousands of angry bees, and somehow reach inside. No protective clothing, no modern tools, just a human and a swarm of bees. So who was the first person brave enough to try? And why would anyone risk getting stung just to taste something sweet? The truth is, we don't know who the first honey hunter was. There is no ancient record saying, this was the first person to eat honey. And that's what makes the story so fascinating. Because honey was not invented. It was discovered long before cities, long before writing, long before organized farming. There were wild bees. And wherever there were bees, there were hidden stores of honey. For early humans, honey would have been something completely different from almost every other food they knew. It was naturally sweet. It was energy-rich. And unlike many fresh foods, it could remain preserved for an incredibly long time under the right conditions. But there was one problem. The honey wasn't sitting conveniently on the ground. It was protected, inside nests, high in trees, inside rock crevices, or hidden in places where thousands of bees were ready to defend it. So the first challenge wasn't understanding honey. The first challenge was getting past the bees. And that raises an even bigger question. What could possibly convince a human to take that risk? The answer may be hiding in something very simple. Our ancestors were constantly searching for calories. Every day was a calculation. What can we eat? Where can we find it? And how much energy will it give us? Honey offered an extraordinary reward. A small amount could provide a concentrated source of energy. And unlike many dangerous animals, bees were small. Their nest could potentially be approached. And once humans discovered that the reward was worth the pain, they had a reason to come back. But finding honey was only the beginning. Because eventually, humans had to learn something even more important. How do you take honey without getting overwhelmed by the bees? And that's where the story becomes even more interesting. Imagine seeing a wild beehive for the first time. You hear the buzzing before you see it. Hundreds, maybe thousands of insects moving around a single nest. Inside that nest is something valuable. But the moment you get too close, the entire colony can react. For an ancient human, this wasn't a harmless snack. It was a dangerous extraction. Yet humans became remarkably good at it. Sometimes the nests were found in trees, sometimes in rock shelters, sometimes in holes or cavities barely within reach. That meant honey hunting could involve climbing, reaching, balancing, and sometimes taking enormous physical risks. But humans had one advantage. We could learn. A person who got stung didn't necessarily forget the experience. They could observe what happened. They could try a different approach. They could watch how other people did it. And eventually, one discovery would change everything. Smoke. Smoke can disrupt the defensive behavior of honeybees. It doesn't simply put the bees to sleep, as popular stories sometimes suggest. Instead, smoke can make bees less likely to aggressively defend their nest, giving a honey hunter a better chance to approach. That simple discovery transformed honey collection. A dangerous encounter became a controlled process. And once humans learned how to manage bees, honey became more than a rare lucky find. It became a resource. There's something else worth picturing here. In some traditional honey hunting cultures, people learned to recognize bee behavior and follow bees straight to their nests. A tiny insect, in a sense, became a guide. And honey wasn't valuable only because it was sweet. Ancient people eventually used it in foods, in drinks, in traditional medicine, and as a valuable trade good. In some societies, it became associated with wealth, ritual, and even the gods. And nowhere is that clearer than ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt gives us some of the clearest evidence for how important honey became. Honey appears in Egyptian art, writing, food traditions, and religious practices. Beekeeping was practiced in ancient Egypt, especially along the Nile. And that makes perfect sense. The Nile Valley provided a productive environment for agriculture. Flowers meant bees. Bees meant honey. And honey meant something incredibly valuable. Imagine living in a world without modern sugar. There are no supermarkets, no bags of refined sugar sitting in your kitchen, no cheap sweets, no candy factories. If you wanted something intensely sweet, honey was one of the most important natural options available. That made it valuable, and ancient Egyptians understood its value. Honey was used as food. It was used in preparations associated with medicine, and it could appear in offerings and religious contexts. But there is another reason ancient Egypt is so important to the story. The Egyptians became skilled beekeepers. Instead of constantly searching for wild colonies, humans could begin keeping bees in constructed hives. The bee was no longer simply an insect protecting a hidden treasure. It became part of an agricultural system. People could manage colonies, move hives, harvest honey, and keep bees near areas rich in flowers. Think about the distance that had been covered. At the beginning, a human sees a wild hive, risks getting stung, and steals a little honey. By the time we reach Egypt, humans are managing entire colonies on purpose. That is the journey from honey hunting to beekeeping. And it didn't happen overnight. It was the result of generations of quiet observation. Seasons, flowers, weather, bee behavior, the timing of honey production. This is one of the most important things about ancient technology. It wasn't always one brilliant invention. Sometimes, it was thousands of tiny observations accumulated over centuries. And honey is a perfect example. Ancient Egypt wasn't alone in this fascination either. Greeks valued it. Romans valued it. People across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East developed their own relationships with bees and honey. Because to ancient eyes, bees were doing something that looked almost supernatural. They disappeared into flowers and returned with something sweet, something humans hadn't planted, cooked, or made themselves. But bees had one more trick that made honey feel truly extraordinary: its ability to remain stable for a very long time. So, why can honey survive for such an incredibly long time? The answer isn't magic. It's chemistry. Think of honey as an environment that's simply hostile to survive in. For bacteria, at least, honey is naturally low in available water. And microorganisms like bacteria and many fungi need water to grow. It's also naturally acidic, and bees add enzymes to nectar as they turn it into honey. Put together, it's a bit like trying to grow a garden in a desert. Technically not impossible, but nothing wants to. But there's an important detail. Honey doesn't automatically stay perfect forever. Its condition depends on how it was stored. If water gets into honey, its moisture level can rise, and that can allow fermentation or microbial growth. So when archaeologists find ancient honey that remains preserved, the conditions surrounding it matter enormously. A sealed container, a dry environment, stable temperatures, limited exposure to moisture. And this is why ancient Egyptian tombs are so fascinating: enclosed, dry, and able to preserve objects for extraordinarily long periods. But there is a difference between saying, "Ancient honey has been found preserved," and saying, "Every 3,000-year-old jar of honey is perfectly edible." Those are not the same claim. The famous story of ancient Egyptian honey being found after thousands of years and still edible has been repeated for decades. But the exact details are difficult to verify. So the scientifically safer conclusion is this: honey can remain remarkably well preserved for very long periods under favorable conditions. And that alone is incredible, because it means something created by a tiny insect can outlast generations of humans. A bee collects nectar from flowers. The colony transforms it. Humans harvest it. Someone seals it in a container. And then centuries pass. Kingdoms rise. Kingdoms fall. Languages disappear. Cities are buried. And the honey can still remain. That is why honey became more than food. It became a symbol of abundance, immortality, wealth, and preservation. The first honey hunter didn't know they were beginning a tradition that would last thousands of years. They weren't thinking about agriculture or civilization or future generations. They simply wanted food. But that simple desire set off a chain reaction. Humans noticed bees. They noticed where bees built nests. They discovered honey. and how dangerous it was to take. They learned to approach more safely. They discovered smoke. They learned the seasons. And eventually, they stopped chasing bees and started keeping them. This is one of the most fascinating patterns in human history. We don't simply find resources, we learn to manage them. A forest is something we hunt in until we learn to plant crops. Animals are something we chase until we domesticate them. And bees are something we steal honey from until we learn to keep them. That shift, from taking what nature offers to building systems around it, is one of the quiet turning points of civilization. Even today, the basic relationship remains surprisingly similar. Flowers provide nectar. Bees collect it. Bees transform it. Humans harvest the result. Thousands of years have changed the tools, not the basic partnership. And perhaps the strangest part of the entire story is that humans never truly invented honey. We didn't design it. We didn't manufacture the first batch. For most of human history, we didn't even understand what bees were doing. We simply found something nature had already created and realized how valuable it was. So when you see a jar of honey today, it may look ordinary, just a golden liquid sitting in a container. But its story is ancient. It connects modern humans to people who climbed trees, entered caves, followed bees, got stung, learned from their mistakes, and eventually figured out how to live alongside one of nature's most fascinating insects. So, who was the first person brave enough to reach into a wild beehive? We may never know. There was no historian standing nearby, no camera, no written record, just one human, one wild colony, and one incredible discovery. Maybe that person was desperate for food. Maybe they saw an animal eating honey and followed the clue. Maybe they simply noticed bees returning to the same place again and again. We can't know for certain, but we do know what happened afterward. Humans kept coming back, and thousands of years later, we are still eating the same golden substance. The bees changed very little. The honey changed very little. But the humans, they changed everything. Because sometimes the greatest discoveries in human history don't begin with a scientist. They begin with someone asking a very simple question: what is that? And then being brave enough to find out.